Welcome to Master Your Finances. Do you like to gain valuable insights on a range of topics, including leadership, business strategy, and clean energy innovation? Are you interested in learning about the challenges that may arise when starting and growing your own business? Do you want to know how to build a strong brand, assemble teams, and raise funds? If so, you want to hear from Dan Javan, the founder and CEO of Centuity. Centuity is a nationwide renewable energy company that specializes in residential solar, commercial, and utility scale projects. With over 2 decades of experience, Dan is uniquely qualified to help you feel empowered and confident in your ability to apply the insights and knowledge he shares. He'll motivate you to implement new strategies and take steps towards achieving your goals, as well as inspire you to contribute to environmental stewardship and make positive changes related to clean energy adoption. All right, Dan, thanks first for coming on the show. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your journey as the founder and CEO of Centuity and what inspired you to start a renewable energy company in the first place?
Yeah, Kurt, thanks for having me, and glad to be on your show. I think renewables is probably the 4th iteration in my journey in business. It's started off with aviation, moved into technology, moved into pharmaceuticals, and of course, here I am now in renewables. So this is my 4th iteration. And again, along the way, I've picked up things in life, I think, that have helped each iteration do better. Really got into the renewables game about 13, 14 years ago, and really started with my own home, right? Putting solar on my home. And at that time, it was more than cost savings. It was really environmental stewardship to, do things right for the environment. But then while doing that, I found out there's a pretty good way of actually saving money, right, while doing that. So, back in the day when I installed my system on my home, it cost $140,000. And,
Wow.
back in 2008, 2009, 140,000 would buy you a house. And most people thought there must be something actually wrong with me to put $140,000 in a system due to environmental concerns. But what they didn't recognize is my system paid for itself in 2 years,
Oh, wow.
right?
Really?
Try to get a house to pay for itself in 2 years, right? And when people come back and say, how did that happen? The simple answer is there's so much incentivization at a federal level, at a state level, and even local jurisdictional level that most homeowners, business owners don't recognize. It's when you find out you're leaving money on the table, right? So when you start looking at that, now if you bring in a solution that actually almost offsets, if not eliminates, your electric bill, generates revenue through green tags that you get from different states, plus pays for itself in 2 to 5 years, and continues to generate revenue for you as a profit center for another 10, 15 years post. I mean, it's a no-brainer. The first question people say is, well, where's the snake oil? Right? Well, there isn't really a snake oil out here. It's actually proven, it's actually available, it's actually publicly available. But again, so to take that and build the business that we've built now, we're licensed in 26 states in the US. We have operations in 25 states in the US, pretty much across most of the Eastern Seaboard, parts of the Midwest, and the Western parts of the US. We cater to, we'll originate this year close to, 10,000 homes. That puts us in the top 15 in the country. But again, really, it's an opportunity I think that every business owner and homeowner should leverage because it's readily available to you, and now more than ever under the Biden administration. So again, that's just a journey. Start off with, the environmental side of it, but it quickly transformed in the monetization side of it, which I think we're going to talk a little bit more about in this meeting.
No, I agree. I think most of us understand, the green energy side as far as, saving energy and fuel and not having to use natural resources more directly. Do you want to tell us a little bit about like the just touched on it? Like, I mean, saving 140,000. You must have had an expensive electric bill. That seems like a big number to me. I'm like, I have some bad bills, but they're not that bad.
Yeah, no, I mean, so back in the day, right, 2008, 2009, we were paying $8 a watt for solar, right? So today solar is almost a third that price. So
okay.
just the same system would cost you almost 3 times as much back then. But
Right.
the simplest answer is how did I actually pay for itself in 2+ years? We had green tax from the state at $640 a megawatt hour, like a 10 kW system would produce about 12 of that. Plus, I mean, the offset of electric, plus you get 30% as an investment tax credit from the feds. Plus the state of New Jersey back then was paying for 50% of the system, right? So between the federal tax benefits, the state tax benefits, or the rebate, plus now the green tax, plus the electric savings, the system paid for itself. So fast forward to where we are
Okay.
today, right?
I
But
got
if you
you.
fast forward to where you are today, I mean, we're now at about a 6-year payback. But again, when you're a business owner, I mean, I can maybe count on one hand investments you can make that have a payback of 6 years or less. I mean, that's a
Right.
pretty high IRR, right? So, and if you can monetize that with basically a loan that basically might extend it out another year, if you're trying to track your IRR, it's infinity, right? At
Hmm.
that point, you don't care about an 18%, 19% return because the savings and the revenue pay off any loan you have. It's a self-sustaining investment, right? And we can get into details around that. I'm sure your viewers will probably be wondering how and why, but um, there are a lot of options and incentives that are available today that let you do that across the country.
Right, right, absolutely. And I do know that each state is a little bit different. I mean, I remember reading that New Jersey tends to be at the top of the list when they talk about, renewable energy. I mean, I happen to, we're working remotely, so I'm actually in Florida right now, and I know I was surprised when I didn't hear like Florida was like, the leading, one of the leading states in solar when there's so much sun down here. It's literally the sunshine state. And New Jersey was ahead of it when I was looking at these surveys, which surprised me a little bit, only because it seems like it'd be pretty easy to roll out a solar farm or whatever down in Florida. But can you explain a little bit of the dynamics about how like a state like a New Jersey seems to be one of the leaders? Seems to be some of the more northern states, right? Is that
Yeah,
can you
yeah.
explain a little bit how that all that's working out?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'll start with Florida, right? So Florida, you got FPNL, right? So FPNL, in fact, even though the reason why the utility rates are low in FPNL, if you actually look at a lot of the solar installed in Florida today, yes, residential solar and small commercial solar is beginning to pick up, but your utility rates are pretty low right now, right? So solar has to compete with a low utility rate. And the reason why your utility rate is low is because FPNL has some of the largest utility scale solar projects in the country, right? So
Mhm.
Nextera, which FPNL has an option on, is in Central Florida with hundreds of megawatts of utility scale solar that actually help FPNL subsidize the cost of electricity. I mean, when you look at a utility scale solar, you're producing power in the 1.5 to 2 cents a kilowatt hour range. It doesn't get cheaper than that. Hydro doesn't compete, nuclear doesn't compete at 1.5 to 2 cents a kilowatt hour. Now, when you look at the northern states, most of the power coming out of northern states is either historically coal, which is really the Ohio Valley, or nuclear. And most people don't recognize the production of power in nuclear is cheap, but the actual decommissioning of our nuclear power plant costs almost 4 times as much as building one, right? So now when you start building in cash reserves, that has to reflect in the cost of power. So when you look at your cost of power up in, say, New York, 28 cents a kilowatt hour compared to FPL at 4 cents, it requires initiatives like solar to actually offset that production. And that's really why you see states in the northern or northeast parts of the US generating more incentives towards solar to offset that high cost of power, which, the cost of production itself of the power is high. So leading states are like Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York now, with the different incentives they have, New Jersey, Maryland, PA, right? I mean, you wouldn't expect PA, which is more
That's like an
leaning.
oil state. That's a big oil
Yeah, so
state.
it's a red state, but they've got SRECs in PA too, right?
Right.
South Carolina, right? They've got state tax credits for solar. So all these states, if you're in these states, you can leverage, renewables. And now, of course, if you go west, I mean, California is like a different country, but California with high cost of power has incentives for solar. You look at other states like Arizona and Nevada that are coming up with incentives. So really, I think there's a lot of opportunity across the country, regardless of whether you want a business out there or a home out there that you can benefit from. And of course, each state has slightly different incentives and quirks. But again, most of the Northeast, I mean, it's a slam dunk. It's a home run. There's no reason why you shouldn't do it.
And you've been in this for a long time, and I know that I keep reading articles, and you can probably dig deeper into this, is how it seems to me like the incentives kind of line up with the efficiency of the solar itself, right? So the solar is becoming more and more cost effective to compete directly, right, without incentives. So is that why we went from this like 2-year payback, because it was heavily subsidized by federal and state just to get it started, which, you know, the federal government does that a lot, and it's necessary because otherwise people wouldn't. I mean, who's going to pay $140,000 and not have any type of incentive to do that? Very few, right? But
That's
now
right.
we're getting to the point where it's kind of like, okay, this is close. So the incentives are much smaller, but the solar itself is less, right? The actual cost of the commodity is less. So where do you,
Right.
this sounds like it's going to be pretty close, where just on its own, it's going to start being cheaper based on what it's becoming more efficient over time, right? Is that what's happening
Yeah.
now? Do you seeing that?
Yeah. So if you look at certain states, right, New York, for example, or you look at Connecticut, I mean, solar today has grid parity. And what that means is solar can actually compete with utility rates without incentives because the utility rate is so high, 28 cents, 29 cents. You look at Hawaii, 34 cents, 38 cents a kilowatt hour. I mean, you don't need incentive to support solar. If you look at the Virgin Islands, 54 cents a kilowatt hour. You don't need an incentive package to support a 54-cent a kilowatt hour offset. I mean, solar will beat that hands down without any incentives. But what I'm alluding to is as the cost of solar comes down, the cost of utility goes up, the feds and the states are pulling back on incentives because they don't need to incentivize and subsidize it as much. So if you play this forward 6, 7 years, you're going to have most incentives will run out across the US because solar will be able to compete at grid parity across most of the states across the US in the 6 to 7 year range. But the important thing is what you can do with it now, right? If you take action
Right.
now, you know, your payback is going to be 6, 7 years, depending on what state you're in. If you take action 6 or 7 years from now, it might be 10 years, which again is not a bad payback on a system that has a life expectancy of 35, 40 years. You know, payback in 10 years actually to me is a slam dunk. You know, people buy, you know, buildings and depreciate that over 20 plus years. Why won't you do that with solar in 10? But the action that you should take is really now, while incentives and subsidies are pretty strong. So, you know, one of the things that the Biden administration did was they pushed out the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, that actually has a decent amount of incentives in there for renewables. And of course, solar is just part of it. But again, you know, all these regulations, to be frank, is only as good as the next change in Congress and the next, you know, change in the White House, right? So if you have
Right.
these changes happening, you know, really you've got a 2 year window in front of you, or a year and a half. If the
Right.
change you think is going to occur at a congressional level or the White House level, this is why you need to monetize in the next 2 years because you grandfather yourself in when that happens. So the time to act really is now.
No, I agree. I mean, you have it, bird in the hand is better than two, you know, two in the bush, so to speak, right? So you know what you've got, and you know your payback time. I know one of the things that comes up a lot, at least when I talk to people, is, well, what about like my roof on my house? If you're going to put a solar, I know years ago, I think you've resolved this. Maybe you can speak to it though. Is if you put a solar panel on there and all of a sudden I get a roof leak in 2 years, now I've got a problem. I got to take the solar panels off and I got to fix the roof. And so now my cost of repair goes up. But I believe the industry solved that issue. You want to talk to that a little bit
Yeah,
about
no,
how that's
absolutely.
handled?
So, yeah, no, so technology has come a long way, right? And that includes not just the electronics and the solar, but even the racking systems, right? So the racking systems right now, most of the standoffs, include certain types of butyl tape on it that guarantee a waterproof attachment point, regardless of how it's, you know, how it's installed. Um, in addition to that, any integrator or solar installer across the country with any level of credibility will give you a warranty on the roof, right? Like, for example, we give you a 10-year warranty on the roof, right? So, and we guarantee all the penetrations, which means if you're going to have a problem for the next 10 years, we're going to come out and fix it. And again, we don't usually have a lot of problems using the new butyl tape methods of attachment. But again, it's all part and parcel of what we do. And in addition, the roof under the solar system actually lasts longer. It has less UV exposure, less exposure to the elements. So you actually are indirectly extending the life of your roof. And again, if a leak has to happen, it's going to happen in the first couple of cycles. And most of
Right.
it happens because of expansion contraction in winter. So if you're in the southern, states, you don't have expansion contraction winter, so that won't happen. But in the northern, it's really, you might have ice damming that actually ends up with some kind of leak. But again, it doesn't happen with the newer technologies out there on attachment points. I mean, that used to happen 5 years ago, 6 years ago, more often, but it doesn't happen as much right now. I think the industry has really transformed from technology and attachment points that negates that.
Okay, so I guess another now what about like just the general maintenance of it? I know maybe you address this now, but I don't know, how often do you need to clean these, right? I mean they're glass, so is it not a big deal? Is the rain sufficient to keep them pretty
Yeah.
clean? Or do you have to worry about any of that? Is that pretty natural
Yeah,
the
I
way it
mean,
happens?
yeah, no, most of the US you don't have to. Maybe in certain parts of Arizona, Nevada, and the desert, climates, you might have to clean them out because you don't have rain sometimes for almost a year. But
Right,
most of the US, the rain just washes it off. In fact, in the Northeast, when you actually have snow, snow actually attaches itself to any dirt on the roof,
right.
on the solar. So when it actually melts, it actually just runs off with that. So you'll see after a snowstorm, your panels look almost like brand new. So in fact, you don't have really any maintenance or cleaning. And again, there's no moving parts when it comes to solar, right?
Hmm.
So unlike wind, where you need to change bearings and things like that, solar is a stationary product. There's no moving parts, and it's basically minimal maintenance, if any. And again, maintenance happens with larger inverters where you're really cleaning like air filters, which again, if you got an air filter, you got to clean that anyways in your HVAC once a year. You just take it out and do it, and it's all readily accessible. But outside of that, I mean, it's maintenance is minimal.
Excellent. We're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Master Your Finances. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're listening to Master Your Finances with Dan Javan, and we're talking about solar power and some of the things that have been happening over the years to make it a little bit better, and how the incentives have actually dropped because they become more efficient, right? And they've become cheaper to actually install, and they're better to install now because they've resolved some of the issues with the roof and really don't have to maintain them too often. So they're pretty low maintenance once you get the things loaded on there. So let's talk a little about the branding. So how did you go about establishing and maintaining like Centuity's branding identity? So what strategies you use to differentiate your company from other competitive renewable energy companies out there? Because I know that when this first started to happen, everybody I heard of, it was like, oh, I'm in the solar business. It's like I can't tell you how many people I talked to were in the solar business that a year later they weren't in the solar business. Let's just say.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, Kurt. It's solar started off as a cottage industry, right? So you had a lot of folks that basically were in carpentry and electrical work that got into solar, but very few, business owners jumped into solar that had prior Fortune 100 and Fortune 500 experience. That's been my background, right? So I come out of Fortune 100 companies, and to be able to scale, the business requires you put things into place that starts from personnel and products and deliverables all the way up to finances. So when we got into the actual solar transactions, really, it was never on a transactional basis. It was really to meet and exceed expectations we set with our customers, because that's really how businesses grow. I learned early on that you need to build trust every day with your customers, with your colleagues, and your partners, right? And using that mantra is really what's been propelling our business forward. Um, we try to always exceed expectations. Don't set promises you can't deliver on. And one thing that's extremely important, and you'll see a lot of fly-by-night guys, two men off a bus. Like you said, we're in the solar business. Um, don't do things that are in the gray area. Don't do things that are legal. Don't skirt on laws, because at the end of the day, you're putting a power plant on someone's house or business, right? If you don't know what you're doing, you can do a lot of damage. And a lot of people look at the lowest price point. They might look at the quality of the product, but what they miss is the quality of the workmanship of the actual installation, right? So part and parcel of what we did was bring in talent that actually was used to delivering with quality. Like we've got a full, QA/QC department that actually reviews every single project. To do more of that, I think is really what started building the brand image of the organization. But then, of course, at the same time, it's being able to scale, and a lot of that comes from prior experiences I've had in my other businesses.
No, that's excellent. And you bring up something, because I know, when I was hearing, I mean, there's only so many, I mean, I don't know how many there are, but there's several big companies that make solar panels, right? But there's more people that actually install them. So even though you might have the same name of the product, the installation is still important. It's just like hiring a carpenter. I mean, you can go down and buy 2x4s down at Home Depot, and they're all going to be pretty much the same, no matter who buys them. But how they get installed and built, how it builds your house out, could be very different depending on the skill set of the carpenter that came in there to actually do the work, right?
Right.
So I agree, especially with a roof. And you're right, it is a power plant. People don't realize you've got whatever 7,500 kilowatt, whatever the number is on your roof. That's a power plant. So it's you need to pay attention. There's a lot of power coming out of that, and you can get hurt or killed if you don't treat it correctly, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I mean, and people sometimes, skimp on the pricing. It's like heart surgery, right? If you're going to replace your valve, would you go to the cheapest surgeon in the block? Right? You wouldn't, right? You'd go to the best skill, the one who has the highest ratings, the one that actually delivers, success every time. I mean, people need to keep that in mind because, like we said, it's if you don't do it right, you can do some damage.
right. So that's really important. So you talked a little bit about, like, because you came from a Fortune 500 background. So you want to tell us a little bit about some of the key principles you use in actually building the team, and then how do you ensure like there's a cohesive this between and motivation in the workforce there. So how do you make sure they're all, because it's become a large, if you're doing 10,000 houses a year, that's a pretty big business. I'm sure you're not out on every side of every house when they're being built. So you've got to have a nice team in place.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're only as good as your weakest link, and you're only as good as the leaders in your organization that actually downstream, right? So the important thing is making sure at any given time you exceed expectations. And again, I'll be humble enough to acknowledge that we've not always done that, but we've always had the intent to do that, right? And what that means is when, relationships are built, not when things are going well. It's when things are not going well. What you do differentiates you from the others, right? And we always like to stand behind our installs and our product and differentiate ourselves when it comes to that. A lot of people don't think of it that way. It's maybe I'm a more traditionalist when it comes to business acumen around it, but I think there's still a place, in the country today, in the world today, for some of these traditional business methodologies where a handshake means something, promising someone that you deliver on means something, right? And I think people actually appreciate that. So from our perspective, it's deliver with excellence, exceed expectations, surround yourself, frankly, with people that know more than you do, right? If you're the most knowledgeable person in the room as a leader, you got a problem, right? You need to get to a point where you can become obsolete in your organization. And the day you can do that, you actually build a successful organization. A lot of leaders that are new to the game feel that as a threat, right? That's really not a threat. I mean, there's really nothing for you to lose. It's your organization. But to do those things, I think, are the things that you use to, get to success. And then obviously build a culture. The culture has to be built around excellence, leadership, leading from the front, and also have a sense of humility. Because if you don't have humility, you can't acknowledge mistakes you made. If you can't acknowledge mistakes you made, you're not going to be able to fix them. So those are just some of the things that, me at a personal level, I leverage. And a lot of this stuff, Kurt, I mentioned, I started off my background in aviation. I used to be a commercial pilot, I used to be a flight instructor. I mean, in aviation, there's no room for error, right? You have checklists, but you also have to acknowledge mistakes, because if you don't, you got 150 lives or 200 lives behind you that get impacted by your actions or inactions, right? And that's why you have checks and balances, right? The day you recognize that, regardless of whether you're the owner of the company or the CEO of the company, your fiduciary obligation starts to your customers and to your company. Everything else has to fall in line. I think you're going to start executing along those lines. And those are just some of the morals and qualities that I've actually leveraged to actually help grow my businesses.
And you bring up some really valid points. I mean, I had a personal experience with like a large HVA company locally. It was regional, and they actually made a mistake. They installed the wrong unit, and very expensive to pull it out and put a whole new unit in. They asked, we went through negotiation, but I really wanted that unit, and they actually did it and didn't complain. And it's like, because I know how much money they lost on that, but they made a mistake, and I'm sure
Right.
they learned things, they put things in place, but I now use them for everything, because I
Right.
know if something goes wrong, if they agreed to do it, they're gonna do it right.
Yeah.
So
They probably made
I
more money with referrals through you
oh
because
my
of
God,
that
yeah.
than the
I
money they would
agree.
have actually saved on not changing that, right? So, that's what we need to roll forward on. So,
And I think, and you point out, I think a lot of businesses, they look very myopic on this one transaction. If I lose X dollars, I mean, I'm going to suffer a loss. It's almost like, hey, look, if you resolve a problem, that's a marketing cost in my view, right? It's kind of like, hey, you made a mistake. We all make mistakes, but we learn from those mistakes. So that means that next 100 that go out the door, you're probably not going to make that mistake. The next 1,000, the next 2,000, whatever the number is, that is highly unlikely to happen, because you're going to put something in place to prevent that or minimize the chance of that ever happening again. And I'm sure you probably had some things along your way where you're like, oh, we don't want that happening again. So here's what we're going to do now to make sure no other customer has to be involved in that particular situation again, because we had some break in our system or our process that wasn't quite working the way we hoped it would work, right?
yep, absolutely, you're spot on.
Yeah. All right. So we're going to take another quick break. You're listening to Master Your Finances. Welcome back. You're listening to Master Your Finances. I'm here with Dan Javan, and we're talking about solar, which is pretty great, and learning how to put a good team in place and really paying attention to your customer and trying to resolve issues, because that is the best way to gain trust among your base. So how did you get this started? I mean, you had to go out. This is a relatively new industry, so to speak. You had to go out and get funding. And so what advice would you have for other entrepreneurs that might be seeking capital for their renewable energy ventures they may be thinking about? What would you suggest to them?
Yeah, so my first response is get creative. And what that means is, think outside the box, right? So most people that get into a business or want to launch something, the first idea is, well, how do I leverage the banks and get a loan, right? There's different ways of actually raising cash and capital well beyond just banks. And again, I'm not talking about the private equity side. I mean, so one of the advantages in the solar industry is, there are existing finance companies that actually finance projects that have milestone payments, right? I mean, that's the cheapest way you can actually raise capital. That is project based, right? Again, based on the milestone, you can have surplus cash in there that you can leverage to run your operations and actually build an operations. But the important thing is, one of the first things you should do is try and put, job costing on a per project basis. If you're actually going to try to raise capital, or again, if you're just a business in general, really make sure that your use of funds is for the appropriate means that you actually took the cash out of. I mean, in addition to that, for renewables today, you have green banks that are willing to give you loans at low interest rates. You have different finance companies that will fund you. You have EPCs that will actually own the system and just sell you the power through a PPA or a lease agreement, right? That you can actually then buy out after 6 years or 7 years from them, right? So let them
You,
bear their initial upfront cost, right? That's
you,
another methodology. And
you just
now,
went through I'm sorry, I didn't
sorry,
interrupt you, but you're going through a lot of strategies, which I don't think the listeners are going to quite catch on. So you mind just talking, anyway, we'll get through them all. I would definitely want to get through them all,
okay.
but you want to break down maybe how that project base works, or might have, you just give us kind of a structure, an example structure of like how that might work. I mean, you've been doing this a long time, so you're more, so tell us, okay, that's a great idea. So how would I kind of do that? I mean, what are some methodologies apart? Like just the basics, not too much detail, but what the basics of how
Yeah,
you might do
yeah.
that.
So the easiest financing you can get, frankly, is a loan for the project, right? So you can get a loan from the Green Bank, you can get it from the SBA, you can get it from your local bank. That's one methodology. Um, and again, getting a loan is fairly straightforward. You basically have your financials that you offer them, and they'll say yeah or nay, and then it's going to be for the project itself. Most banks will give you a loan today with no liens on your actual asset other than the project itself, right? That's one way of doing it. The other option I brought up is like a power purchase agreement or a lease, where you don't have to own the system, at least not on day one. Just buy the power from the system, let somebody else own it and fund it and have a buyout option, right? To me, that's actually usually the best way to do it. Is if you do that, the system is now being run, tested, maintained, insured at someone else's, expense. And then, like a lot of business owners may not have the tax appetite, right, to take all the tax benefits having a PPA or a lease is probably the best way to do it, because a third-party financier takes all the tax benefits, just like you're leasing equipment, right? There's no difference between leasing a solar and leasing a vehicle. You do it the same way, and then you do a buyout clause at the end of 6 years or 10 years or whatever. The system's already been tried, tested, proven, it's reliable, the guarantees and warranties, are in place. At that point, you do a buyout and then you take a loan, right? Or then you can actually run that off cash flows. Like in states where you have SRECs, right? Green tags, Jersey, Maryland, Massachusetts, you could even forward contract on the green tags. Like for example, New Jersey, it's $100 a kilowatt hour, megawatt hour for 15 years. Let's say you had a 100 kW system that would give you about $12,000 of green tags. You can take a loan against the green tags, right? And collateralize just the green tags. You can even actually sell your green tags up front for a discount based on, a discount rate that you can agree upon, 6%, 7%. So there's a lot of different ways. And I can pretty much write, several pages around this, because there's so many different creative ways of doing this. But again, I started off the discussion saying you have to get creative. There's a lot of money sitting out there. Like even the Department of Commerce is sitting on cash that you can leverage.
Are there any resources somebody could go to kind of research like some methodologies on how to finance like green or solar? I mean, are there places that kind of hubs that you can go to and kind of say, hey, here's some options that we see are working right now?
Yeah, so I'll give you a high level. So if you go to the CL website, which is SEIA.org, which is the Solar Energy Industries Association, they have different types of financing on there. Now, I won't give you details of who the financiers are, but it'll tell you different options, right? And if you now just run a Google search for certain types of financing in solar, you'll get pages and pages of companies that are willing to provide it, right? I mean, when we started in renewables and solar 12 years ago, we had maybe folks you can count on one hand, right? Solar is now a multi-billion-dollar industry, and the financing portion of it is even bigger. So, I mean, there's financing readily available. All you have to do is know what keywords to use, and you can pick up the keywords from the SEIA website and run searches for that.
Okay, that's fantastic. Wow. I had no idea there was that many different ways to, I know some of those things, but I was like, wow, that's a lot of different options out there. So let's just say that it's developed and it's matured to the point where the bigger investors are very interested in this, because I guess they're probably seeing a pretty good return and a relatively low risk rate, I'm going to assume, right? Is that what's been kind of happening out there? It's a relatively low risk strategy for people.
Yeah. So default rates are really low because solar saves you money. So if someone is defaulting, they're going to have to pay a high electric bill. And what happens with the high electric bill that you don't pay is you get shut off, right? So it's a utility that you can't live without. So you'd rather pay your solar bill than have to pay a high utility rate, right? So when you look at default rates, it's really low. Even with all the issues of the pandemic and capital markets tightening up, the default rates are pretty low because people typically pay the utility bills, right? So it's a fairly risk averse transaction. And at the end of the day, if you don't pay your bill, the financiers have the right to redirect the power to the grid anyways, and they'll just monetize it from the utility. So they have
there you go. It's like assignment of leases for a commercial landlord.
Right. So,
the bank is like,
you've got a backstop.
Right. So, what if when I sell my home, I'm assuming these are now assignable, right? I can assume them or assign them.
Yeah. So you can assign them, and again, many financiers have an automatic approval flow in there. So and some of them will come back and say the new homeowner has to qualify. But again, qualification criteria actually go down each year, right? When you first got into this, you need to have a 780 score. I mean, now you can get a lease or PPA down to 600 with certain programs, right? So anyone coming in that qualifies for a mortgage is going to have a score well above that, and it's only going to save them money. So there's no reason why people wouldn't do it. So.
Okay, so yeah, I've never seen an issue with somebody transferring a house with solar on it personally, but I know there's a process. You do have to have an extra couple steps in there, but it just
it's an extra form that you sign. That's it.
Right. So any other financing ideas? I mean, you've got a lot of ideas out there. Any other resources for that? So
no, I mean, it's different for different opportunities, right? So like, for example, under the IRA now you have obviously the ITC, the investment tax credit, was there before, but now you also have a PTC, which is a performance tax credit, right? So you actually get paid based on the performance of the system as another revenue source on top of the power that you save and produce, right? So I would recommend people look at ITC and PTC online for solar, and you'll see different ways of financing, and you can finance the performance revenue also on a system with a loan against that, right? So there's
Okay.
just so many options out there. And again, obviously different folks in different states have different, things that they cater to. You have state tax incentives and state loan incentives too. Like New York has a green bank, right? So they'll
Right.
do actually loans for, different solutions in New York for the commercial side of it, in addition to, all the other financiers that you have that don't need to put money in. So all I'd say is there's just a ton of opportunities out there. If you do the research, you'll find different options, and you should be able to monetize it.
Excellent. We're going to take another quick break. You're listening to Master Your Finances. Welcome back. You're listening to Master Your Finances. I'm here with Dan Javan, and we're talking solar and a lot of opportunities, lots of ways to finance it, lots of incentives and credits from the federal as well as a lot of the states. So you need to look at both levels there. So going forward, solar's obviously developed a long time since I first heard about it in the 70s. And I was putting like reflecto shield on the side of our windows on the house to try to take advantage of not having the house get too hot, a way to save energy during the energy crisis of the 70s. I know we've gone a long way since then. So what do you see as being some of the most significant opportunities or potential roadblocks coming up for companies like Centuity and in the renewable energy industry? And so what's coming up in the years that we're looking forward now?
Yeah, no, so I think one of our biggest challenges has always been educating our customers, right? I mean, the opportunity is there, the incentives are there, but if you don't know about it, there's no value, right? So we spend most of our time educating folks on what the options are, right? And then obviously, once you educate folks, the question is really what's my cost of capital? What's my cost to finance? Because obviously, 90% of this industry runs off financing. So one of the things that we started differentiating ourselves with is how do we get in front of a larger audience, right? So we're actually looking at going public in the upcoming months. Part of that is leveraging the public forums to actually get the word out on the different opportunities and obviously the options that Centuity has to offer across the country. In addition, the other challenge has been cost, right? So cost has obviously come down quite a bit, but there's still a long way to go, and most people don't recognize, right? If you look at the actual breakdown of the cost of solar, I'd say about a third of the cost is acquisition, sales. Another third is buying down your loan APR, depending on whether it's residential or commercial. And then the actual system itself, with our entire margin stack and everything else in the EPC, is really 40% of the cost, right? So if you can start bringing down the cost of acquisition, you bring the cost of financing down, you now are able to bring down the overall cost by almost 25 to 30% at a minimum, right? So one of the reasons why we're also going public is access to cheaper cost of capital, because then we can leverage that cheaper cost of capital and then obviously, leverage that for our customers. The other thing that we've done, and we just put a press release out, is our first direct-to-consumer website, right? In the past, you want to buy a car, you would go to a dealership, right? So up to now, you want to buy solar, someone's got to knock on your door, or you got to call a sales guy, he's got to show up, and he's going to charge you in your cost stack, the cost of acquisition that could be as high as 30%. So with our direct-to-consumer website, it's AI-enabled, financing approval all on the website, contracts all on the website, engineering all on the website through AI technologies at a cost that's about 35% cheaper. And you can go out there right now, buy a system in 15 minutes, fully finance it, and actually walk out of there with a full design, full contracts that you'll actually get a site survey date on, where we'll actually come take a look at your house or your business and actually let you know if this is all good to go. But again, so it's the first website of its type that's AI enabled in the industry. And we're doing that because we want solar to be a lot more accessible to people. And to do that, you've got to bring the cost down, because as you bring the cost down, you open up new states and new markets, because now you can compete with lower utilities. And again, so our direct-to-consumer website's open to all states in the continental US today, and you can transact. But it's stuff like that that we need to do as an industry to actually grow the industry. I mean, if you look at all of last year, the industry installed maybe 600,000 homes, right, across the country, which is nothing. I mean, penetration rate of solar today, 4.6%. There's almost 93.4% of upside if we can actually do things differently. And, there's projections right now in the next 6 to 7 years, the country will be at about 20% of penetration with solar, but it's not going to happen if you don't do these things to bring the cost down, make it more accessible, bring the cost of capital down. And those are the things that we are doing as an organization, and also as a move towards being a public company to be able to leverage that for our customer base and consumer base.
One of the things I read, and I don't know what this means, and you can maybe explain this further. I just remember reading an article like in California, they're having all new homes at some point need to be solar ready. So how does that differentiate between an older home that's already been there for 30, 40 years? And how does that help as far as this process goes? And do you see that happening more and more where the contractor either voluntarily or maybe a state is like requiring it as part of the code?
Yeah.
What do you kind of see and happen
so
out there as far as allowing this to happen?
Yeah, so that's already happening across more than just California, right? So it's happening in Colorado, it's happening in many northeastern states. In fact, New Jersey, like I think year before last, passed a law, any warehouse more than 10,000 square feet has to be equipped for solar. It doesn't need to have
Okay.
solar on it, but equipped for solar means structurally the roof has to be sound to take on additional weight for solar. In addition, the electrical systems have to be sound enough to be able to take the backfeed, right? So you're
Right.
seeing this happening more and more. One of the things that we've taken for granted, I think, in the US that our European counterparts have not is availability of power, right? I mean, if you go to
Right.
Texas today, they don't have power half the time. If it wasn't for solar installations in Texas, the grid would go down, right? If you look at Europe with what's going on with Ukraine and Russia, I mean, energy is not a commodity, it's a necessity without which, I mean, countries literally shut down, right? We've taken that for granted in the US, but I would foresee 10, 15 years from now, renewable production on site is going to become a matter of national security. Most people don't recognize that. I mean, already you're getting into a situation where you have hurricanes, storms, you have homes that are solar with batteries that stay up and running when the rest of the grid goes down, right? It might sound like, well, it's not a needed thing, but say that to someone that's got, someone on a ventilator in the house, right? If they lose power, what happens? People die. So it's going to become a point of necessity in the next 8 to 10 years across the US. And while the incentives are there, people need to take advantage of it right now. So I see where things going across the US in the next decade or so.
You brought up one point that I know comes up a lot that I didn't even think of until you just said it with the battery, the backup, right? Solar's great when the sun's out, but occasionally gets dark at night. So, how is that? Why don't you explain how that technology has been moving? I know, the Tesla's out there, and we hear about that kind of thing as far as the electric car, EVs, that stuff. But how's that relating the battery technology? What's going on in that universe? And how's that affecting the viability of solar as far as your home and what you just spoke of as far as losing power for a bit of time?
Yeah, no, so batteries, right, play more than just one role. Most people look at batteries as ability to go off grid in case of power loss, but most people don't recognize in many states, you got time of use laws for power, right? You've got demand response cost of power, and that happens with businesses too. So now if you can leverage storage, which by the way, costs have come down significantly, and you can spend an hour talking with your storage, if you fast forward to where things are going to go in 5 to 10 years, and it's already happened in California with NEM3, batteries become a revenue source for you because you can store power in the battery from the solar and then sell that power to the grid during time of use. You can sell frequency regulation availability. You can sell demand response availability. So not only are you monetizing kilowatt hours from the solar, you're monetizing kilowatts and kilowatt hours from the battery, not just in the home, but also on the grid. And I'll take this one step further because now EVs kick into gear around this because that's really what's going to drive solar and storage adoption. The biggest battery in your home 10 years from now is not going to be the battery on the wall. It's going to be the battery in the car, right? If you look at EV technologies now, more and more EV charging companies, which is again one of the reasons why Centuri invested in a national EV charging company, Blue Dot, was the battery in the car will eventually power your home and or the grid, right? So when you start thinking along those lines, your battery in your car, like I have a BMW iX50, I have a 113 kilowatt hour battery. That's a big battery, right?
Mhm.
It can easily power your home. And at the same time, if you have grid imbalance, I can redirect the electrons into the grid and actually generate revenue in certain states like California, right? So that is where technology is going. So if you start equipping your home now, right, all this time we've been talking about revenue from kilowatt hour production on solar. What people also need to start looking at revenue generation from kilowatts and electron transfer into the grid from storage in addition to solar. That's going to help propel renewables even more. And that's coming. It's already here in California with NEM3. And we all know what happens in California happens in the rest of the US over the next 5 to 6 years. So that's where we are.
Awesome, Dan. It's been great. The time just flew by. I appreciate you coming on today. Any final word or two before we leave today?
No, I mean, like you said, there's got to be a sense of urgency, I think, to leverage solar technologies. I think the technology is proven, the financing's available, and it's a revenue source that most people don't recognize. And then just really from our perspective, really, we're in this for the long haul. We're in this to build and educate customers and consumers. And, the adoption of what we've been putting in on the EV side and the storage side, I think obviously is going to propagate a lot of that stuff. But Kurt, I guess in a nutshell, I think this was extremely enjoyable. I appreciate you bringing me on, and maybe we can have a follow-up session sometime in the future for this.
That sounds great. All right. Well, thanks again, Dan. Appreciate you coming on. You've listened to Master Your Finances. You can subscribe. Don't forget it, masteryourfinances.us. Have a great day.